There was talk about the new Tory intake and whether they'd be much more right-wing or hardline, if you like, than the previous members of Parliament for the Tory party. During the campaign, during the 3.5 weeks, we did a survey of a large number of candidates, both for the Labour and Conservative parties. And it's quite interesting what it comes up with. A very slight move to the right, but only a very slight move compared with the Conservative Party represented on the benches before, if these figures are right. Interestingly, for instance, on hanging, we don't think that the new House will have a majority on a free vote for hanging. It'll be the same as the old House on that. On the Falklands, interestingly, over 80% of the new Conservative Parliamentary Party, according to this survey, want to enter into negotiations over the Falklands, but want to exclude talks, want to exclude the issue of sovereignty from the talks. Only 12% want to pursue a policy of Fortress Falklands alone. Well, of course, on that, the Prime Minister herself has said that when the war is officially over, there will be talks, or could be talks, on commercial and diplomatic links. A clear majority of the new Conservative want to keep the size of the welfare state much as it is. 22% want to see a reduction, 73% keep it as the same. And they're very slightly drier on economic issues, but only very slightly. In the old House, 40% of Conservative MPs wanted to see an increase in government spending in order to stimulate the economy. That figure, we think, will now drop to 35%, all of which will be of great interest to one of the leading Tory wets who was sacked by Mrs Thatcher, Sir Ian Gilmore, who's standing in his seat of Chesham and Amersham. And Jeremy Paxman is, at his count, they don't count till today, I think, in order to save money. But anyway, Jeremy Paxman is down there.
That's right, the count's going on at the moment, David, and we're expecting Sir Ian here in about another half hour's time. Declaration's expected about 12:15 or 12:30. As you say, Sir Ian Gilmore's really in no danger here. There's been a 76% turnout. And the interest will be, I think, in seeing how solid his position is. It's not, as I say, in any danger, but he is probably one of the best known of the wets. He disappeared, as you know, from the cabinet during the purge of the wets. And it'll be interesting here, and the main interest is centred on whether he's going to consolidate his position. The expectation in the Tory camp is that he will retain his seat comfortably, and that he won't have been damaged in what is a straight three-cornered fight. And with that, back to you in the studio.
Good. Well, Peter Snow we want to go to, right? I was just going to introduce a guest who's just arrived next to me here, Sir Patrick Meany, a member of the Council of the CBI, and who's just been involved in this great battle with Thomas Tilling, of which he remains chairman, despite the fact he's been taken over. I wanted to talk to him, and I shall be talking to him in a moment, and I hope to Len Murray of the TUC about the future relationships over this next 5 years with government. Mr. Murray's there, but just perhaps before I do that, Peter.
Well, David, one thing that will provide ammunition for your talks with them is the intriguing fact that in this election, as in every election since 1955, we have this increasing divide, this increasing gap growing across the country in economic and regional terms. It's just like it's been in every election since 1955. There is the party in the lead in the share of the vote in Scotland, Labour by 10%. Labour has done best in Scotland and the North. There's a Conservative leading by just over 0%, in fact about 0.1% in the North. In Wales, Labour's in the lead by 6%. In the Midlands, the Conservatives are way up in the lead there at 17%, in spite of all that talk about the Midlands deciding it, about the Midlands being the place where the Tories would pay for the unemployment problem. Tories in the lead there by 17%, and look at that massive lead there in the South. And the movement to the Conservatives over the country has been really very little in Scotland, not so much in the North. The Labour vote in the North West and in Scotland's held up pretty well. In Wales, it's been 4% to the Tories. But just look, as you go down the country, how that swing increases. And in the southeast, the other intriguing thing is that there's been a rural-urban divide, as well as that regional divide. There's been this economic divide between the more affluent parts of the country. Look at the southeast outside London. There's just one Labour seat there in Thurrock in Essex. There's no prospect of any other Labour seats anywhere in the southeast. It's gone, the map has gone entirely blue there. Down 6 Labour, up 6 the Conservatives. And here are the gains. There's Hertfordshire West, big swing in Hertfordshire West there was. Stevenage, Oxford East, the most marginal seat in the country went. Basildon Newtown went to the Conservatives, Labour before. Harlow has gone and Joan Lester's seat in Slough. So there is this remarkable changeover here continuing. It's been going on now for more than 25 years with the movement of people in the outer areas, in the rural areas, more to the Conservatives, and the inner areas, the more deprived areas of the country, and in the north, rather less to the Conservatives.
Peter, thanks so much. Well, now, Sir Patrick Meany here and Len Murray in Broadcasting House. Mr. Murray, people think of the unions as the main financiers, as indeed you are, of the Labour Party. What do you make of this defeat? You must be a very disappointed man.
The TUC is not the main financier. We have no political funds. We spend no political money. That is for most of our affiliated unions. But of course I'm disappointed because I was convinced that the proposals made by the Labour Party for getting the economy back off its back, for fairer shares and above all for providing jobs were best. And I still believe that, and I still believe we'll have to come back to it.
But what are you going to be saying, and what are the trade unions going to be saying to the Labour Party after this result?
I emphasise the TUC does not deal with the Labour Party.
Mr. Murray, I said
my friend David Basnett.
I said the trade unions as a whole. I'm thinking that you may be able to speak partly, at any rate, on their behalf.
No, I cannot. Half our unions from the Labour Party, but half are not. That is very much a matter for the trade unions for a Labour victory. I'm concerned with where the TUC will be in relation to the government and in relation to government policies, but not the internal affairs of the Labour Party. Thank goodness. That's not a matter for me.
Right. Well, on the relationship between the government and the TUC, you've been reported as wanting to see a change in attitude. Is that right, and do you expect that to happen?
I'm always looking for, and our attitude is determined what government does, I'm always looking for a government which is prepared to involve us seriously and give us genuine responsibility for solving common problems. We've always been there. I'm sure we will be. We must always be there. But the style is set by government, and we'll have to see what attitude the government is going to take. And they certainly have not offered us any responsibility or any involvement at all so far.
And is there any reason why they should change? I mean, in reality?
Only the reality of the economic situation. The economic problems are still there. The election hasn't solved those. And jobs are still needed desperately. And I'm absolutely convinced that as things develop, and as the government realises that it has got to take the lead in steering our economy back to full employment, it just won't happen of its own accord, then there'll be a job for the trade unions to do. And we've got to be standing ready to do that when the government will deal seriously with us.
Well, Sir Patrick Meany is here, Mr. Murray. I just want to put some of those points to him. But perhaps, first of all, what do you think will happen? Mrs. Thatcher's got this big majority. Do you expect any change at all? Do you think there was a secret manifesto? Does the CBI believe there are things they didn't quite dare do before which they will do now?
No, I don't think there's a secret manifesto. I mean, clearly, a second term in office and the overwhelming confidence that has been shown in Mrs. Thatcher's administration by the majority of the country will, of course, add pace to a number of policies that were both before and in the manifesto. So I see a definite change of pace and determination.
It's actually a minority of the country, 43%.
Yes, I'm sorry. I'm perhaps being overconfident. Yeah.
But, I mean, it may be different because of that.
Well, it may be different, certainly. I would have believed that on the evidence so far, she has got a confident re-election, and that she will be able to do things with greater determination and speed, which is of the essence.
But you've sat with Len Murray often enough on these kind of programmes and talked about the problems of British industry.
Yes.
Do you resent the fact that Mrs. Thatcher doesn't invite Mr. Murray to Downing Street, doesn't ask the TUC in for talks, cold shoulders him? Do you think it's a bad thing, or is it a healthy thing?
I don't believe it's quite as precise as that. I believe that it is correct that the trade unions should be properly consulted, but they did have a great period where the consultation with them was overdone. And I think, as with all good management, sometimes there has to be an immediate overreaction to redress the balance again. It would certainly be my hope and my belief from my meetings with ministers and other people in government that there would undoubtedly be a dialogue, providing the TUC and the trade unions' attitudes is a constructive one towards the continued battle against inflation and the very necessary restructuring of industry and commerce to get our economy back on a sound footing.
So sandwiches and beer again, Mr. Murray, is what Sir Patrick suggests may happen this time round. Do you really believe that?
Well, don't forget that last time we had a constructive relationship with the government, we were largely helpful in bringing inflation down from 28 to 8%, largely responsible for reducing the number of days lost in disputes. This isn't easy. I know that the problems of involving ourselves in the government, of dealing with the government, are difficult ones. I prefer those. But frankly, I have to say that I haven't yet seen any signs on the government part that they see unions as being anything other than a nuisance or an irritant in the body politic.
Very
but
briefly,
I'm just convinced they'll have to come to it.
Very briefly, could you carry your membership of the TUC with you if you were invited?
We've done it before, and I believe we could do it again, so long as our own members see that the government is serious, is doing things which are reasonable for the nation, is getting the economy back on its feet and off its back and off its backside. If they saw that, and if they saw the government wanting to involve us, then I believe we'd have something in our hands to go to the members with and say, this is it. But we'll have to represent our members, whatever we do, and look out for their interests as best we can.
Mr. Murray, thank you very much. Sir Patrick, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, during this whole campaign, one issue which I think almost by universal agreement, certainly if you judge by the polls, that was costing Labour votes was the policy on unilateral disarmament, not perhaps so much the policy as the clear muddle over what actually was going to be done with Britain's unilateral deterrent. It was thought that the CND movement would play a very big part in the campaign. In the event, they kept rather a low profile. Maybe, though, it was because of what had gone on in Greenham Common that the issue had aroused some unpopularity. There was a view that the activities in Greenham Common were, in a sense, counterproductive with the rest of the public. Now, the demonstration there began in September 1981. It's been going on for 18 months. You'll no doubt remember the great human chain of 40,000 that was put round there at Easter. And they're still down there, and today with them, Bob Welling. So let's go over and join him.
Overwhelming victory has been received with, well, I suppose what you'd describe melodious resignation by the women at Greenham Common, who've been camping out for almost 2 years in protest against the cruise missiles which are going to be sighted here. I'll just break into the song. I'll tell you what June is about later. Now, Mrs. Thatcher's overwhelming victory is clearly a mandate for all sorts of things, including cruise and Trident and nuclear defence. Isn't that a blow to your campaign?
To our campaign to stop nuclear missiles? No, I don't think so. I think it shows that the haves are sticking to what they have and not caring about the have-nots.
But don't you have to accept, I mean, the implication is that the country voted for Mrs. Thatcher in large numbers, so therefore they're voting to retain the nuclear deterrent, which of course includes cruise.
I think that half the population, not all the half the population voted for Mrs. Thatcher, and I don't think defence was primarily their vote. I think it was to retain what they have, their houses, cars, money, bank accounts, etc.
Right.
And I'm sure that more and more people will come to realise, we hope, I mean, I think the country deserves what it gets at the moment, and they're sure going to get it.
What effect do you think it's going to have on your campaign?
Well, I think the situation is becoming a lot clearer now, and we've come to the point where we can see very obviously that the Conservative Party is very pro-violence and militarism and nuclear weapons and mass destruction. And I think that people are going to come out firmer. Women are going to campaign even stronger than ever before. And we're going to have a big demonstration on June the 25th where we're inviting all women to come and circle this base. And we're going to have a huge patchwork rainbow dragon circling around this base as a symbol of life. And that's what we're about, life.
So you're not downhearted. I mean, will the campaign continue is really the question.
I think you can probably see and feel here that it's business as usual. We've dealt with this woman before, and we're not pretending we wouldn't have preferred a new crew
but
to do it.
Aren't you ignoring the message which comes over loud and clear that, unfortunately for you, your campaign is pointless?
I can't understand why you say that at all. Because we know that because of this foolish election result, that we'll have to work twice as hard, if not 3 times.
Thank you very much. Well, before we all asphyxiate, thank you very much, ladies. We're going back to the studio. Women. We're going back to the studio in London, David.
Bob Wellings down there at Greenham Common. Now, in a moment, we're going to carry on that debate that we began just a moment ago with Arthur Scargill of the Miners' Union who's joined us and Gavin Laird of the AUEW. Before that, though, Peter.
Well, David, the other big story of the night has been the Liberal-SDP alliance story. A sad one in many ways for them, but they have increased their popular vote to a near record. Let's have a look at the share of the United Kingdom vote. There it is, 43% for the Tories, actually down about 1 or 2% on what it was in 79. The Labour vote way down, 29% there on what it was in 79. But the Liberal-SDP alliance vote is only 3% behind Labour. They're going to come third, but it is the best showing they've made, any third party has made, since 1923, when the Liberals had 29% of the vote and 158 seats. And here we have the Liberals this time going to end up with their SDP partners with only 21 seats. The gains for the Liberal-SDP alliance, 7 altogether. You can see that one way up in the northeast corner of Scotland in Gordon, West Aberdeenshire, and the lowest one there is Yeovil in Devon. Here are the, in Somerset, sorry. And here are the gains, Roxburgh and Berwickshire, nearly 4,000 there. Gordon in Scotland, Liverpool, Mossley Hill's David Alton seat. Montgomery is a Liberal regain from their loss in 79, and the Yeovil win in Somerset. Colne Valley, Richard Wainwright is back. In fact, of course, he was an MP in the last Parliament, but he had to really regain that seat because effectively the boundaries gave it to Labour. And Leeds West, Michael Meadowcroft has come in there with a seat he's been fighting very hard at for now about 15 years. And here is the other side of that story, the failure of the SDP MPs. 2 of them have won, John Cartwright, Ian Wrigglesworth on that first group there, but they're all the losers. Many of them going to the Conservatives, the vote on the left breaking up, and the Conservatives coming through the middle and taking it away from Labour and the SDP. Roy Jenkins won his seat in Hill Head. 4 of them back altogether, including David Owen there in Plymouth. 1 result still to come, Bob McClelland's in Caithness, and he's on the whole tipped to win. David.
Well, down in the centre of Truro this morning, the former MP for Truro, David Penhaligon, who'll be hoping that when his count is announced he'll once again be the MP, and he's there with Valerie Singleton.
David Penhaligon, with the results as they are this morning for the SDP and Liberals, does an alliance exist anymore?
I think an alliance exists. We haven't done that badly, really. No, we've got the biggest third force in the House of Commons since 1929. We got a quarter of the national vote. We're second in something like approaching 300 seats. I can tell you, as somebody who's battled for the third party in British politics for the last 20 years...
Well, the Liberals have done very well, but the SDP haven't done well, have they?
Well, they've got 100-odd second places. Really, to come from nowhere to a substantial force in British politics is probably they've done it more rapidly than anybody else has ever done it. It's not that bad. It's certainly less than we were hoping for, and I would be misleading you if I told you otherwise. But it's not a bad position. Quarter of the national vote, biggest third force since 1929, over 250, approaching 300 second places. That's not a bad platform which to launch the next attack.
David Steele said in a speech a couple of days ago that the party could only go on as a party of equals, that there would be problems if one party did substantially worse than another party. And I think you could say that with 16 Liberals in and 5 SDP, one party has definitely done substantially worse than the other.
Well, that's probably so. I think probably we've got to reflect in the next 2 or 3 months which is the best way of running it. And I certainly think there is at least an argument to be put for the 2 parties becoming one. And I'm not that certain whether running them as 2 separate entities when their policies are so similar, their aims are so similar, is in fact the logical way to go about it. But I'm not being dogmatic about that. Frankly, we got 4 years before the next election, and one thinks that you could reflect on these things in your leisure over the next couple of months.
Why do you think that the Liberals have done so much better than the SDP?
Well, grassroots. I mean, we really have been digging in a long time. We won Yeovil, for example. It looked spectacular on the night, but there's been graft there for 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years, and that goes for a lot of the seats. Quite clearly, the Social Democrats have just not had the opportunity to do that. And one suspects that many of these second places they got now, they can build on with that sort of graft, really get their candidates well known, launch a major attack in that constituency, and indeed take some.
You say you've won Yeovil, but you haven't actually done as well in the West Country as you'd expected, have you?
Well, not all the results are out yet, but no, I think that's true. It's quite difficult then here in the West Country to actually gain seats when the Conservatives are strong, because frankly the third party vote, the Labour vote, was squeezed to nothing a long time ago, and therefore you've actually got to convert Conservatives. Didn't appear this was the week to do that. Perhaps in 4 years' time will be.
Quite a lot of the SDP who lost their seats were MPs who actually defected from another party. Do you think that's a reflection on why they lost?
Well, I think all the ones that lost their seats were ones that deflected. No, Shirley as well, that's right. Well, I think that clearly some of them defected in places where there was very little local base to start with. In fact, looking at the figures, a lot of them polled enormous sums of votes, and there were several of them went down by less than 1,000, which really is rather hard luck. But clearly they hadn't had time to build up the roots, and therefore they lost on the day.
Do you think it's going to be a great loss to the Alliance, Bill Rogers and Shirley Williams, losing their seats?
I've no doubt those and one or two others, John Horam, Mr Roper. I think these people are a really substantial loss to the Alliance, but we've got a lot of people back. We've got Roy Jenkins, David Owen, and it looks as if most of my gang is coming back. So we'll be there, and I think we've got a new pad from which to launch an attack, which next time we'll make it.
Last question, Mr Penhaligon. Will you be there?
Well, I aren't allowed to tell you that. The count's halfway through, but I haven't gone over to Labour Exchange yet.
David Penhaligon, thank you very much. And now back to the studio in London.
David Penhaligon in Cornwall. The Liberals, of course, have had 7 gains, 1 loss. 5 gains from the Conservatives, 2 gains from Labour, which will be good news for David Steele as he looks at the rest of the results this morning. And way up in the other part of Great Britain, in Scotland at Ettrick Bridge, Michael Cole standing outside David Steele's house.
Well, he's not looking at those results yet. He's not up yet, and wise chap, he says he's not going to get up until 11 o'clock. It was 5 a.m. he returned here, and he stood in the dawn drinking champagne. He seemed to me a happy man and a sad man. There was the effervescence of his enhanced personal majority, but the bitter aftertaste that once again the breakthrough hadn't happened. Well, he's bound to return to that theme when he holds a press conference at noon in the Village Hall. The Village Hall where, of course, he voted with such high hopes yesterday and where 2 Sundays ago he held his famous summit. Well, 2 of those summiteers won't be going with him back to Westminster. The village itself is quite quiet this morning, despite all the satellite dishes and electronic gear hanging around. As for the Steeles, well, they're carrying on. They've had 18 years of this, 7 elections, and they're planning a barbecue. They say that it's not a wake, it's a celebration. So it's back to you in London, David Dimbleby.
Michael Cole. Well, in a moment we hope to be going over live to number 10 Downing Street for the first interview with the Prime Minister and the news of her successful outcome of this election. Robin Day will be there to do that interview. While we're waiting for that, if they don't mind being interrupted if we get it halfway through, let's go over and join Donald McCormack and his 2 guests.
First of all, Arthur Scargill, presumably you regard Mrs Thatcher's return to power as a huge disaster, given your prediction during the campaign that if she were returned it would lead to social violence in the cities of Britain.
Yes, I do. I think it's a setback for the Labour Party, obviously, but it's a disaster for the British people. But it really does highlight the stupidity of our electoral system. Here we've got a situation where the Tory party are forming the government on a reduced vote, indeed a similar vote to what I obtained in the miners' union for strike action. I wasn't allowed to implement the strike action because it wasn't enough. She's got a similar sort of vote and she can form a government. So it demonstrates that there's a completely inadequate voting system.
You'll have to join the SDP, Mr Scargill.
No, what will happen is that the Labour Party will have to consider reintroducing proportional representation into its manifesto, because I would remind you that it was in the original manifesto. But that's another point. Yes, it's a setback, but I think that overall, the Labour Party must now reconsider its position, and in doing that, recognise that social violence could erupt in our streets with 4.5 million people unemployed and more to come, and that means that we've got to start and take extra parliamentary action. We've got to talk in terms of taking political strikes rather than merely industrial strikes to save our hospitals, our schools, and our people from attacks on their social services. It's no longer enough to accept that a government elected on 43% of the electoral vote can dictate policies which produce a situation where young people are subjected to helplessness and hopelessness and the indignity of permanent unemployment.
This is the vigorous action against a quasi-Nazi government of which you've spoken before. How vigorous will it actually get?
I think it could get very vigorous indeed. And as I say, it does demonstrate the stupidity of our system, with the Tory party polling less votes this time than last time and forming a government with an increased majority. And what they're now doing is saying, yes, nearly 60% of the British people have voted against us, but we are going to push through measures which will destroy the health service, destroy the education system, undermine the social fabric of your social service system, and at the same time close hundreds of factories, pits and steelworks, and throw thousands and thousands of people out of work. We will resist that policy, and if that means taking action, then we'll take action.
Gavin Laird of the AUEW, do you think that these horrors are now in store for the British people? If so, do you support extra parliamentary action to resist them?
Well, certainly it's a disaster as far as ordinary working men and women are concerned, no doubt about it.
Why did so many of them go along with the verdict?
Bear in mind the point Arthur's already made, they didn't get such an overwhelming vote, but the fact that the Labour lost, it wasn't so much Conservative won as Labour lost, and we have to analyse that. I certainly don't share Arthur's view that necessarily leads to violence, and I certainly will not participate in concerted political strike activity against a government that's been elected. That we have to accept that fact. But by the same token, I put it another way. If the government are stupid enough to embark upon a series of measures to decimate the trade union movement, then we have to resist it. But we'll resist it in the traditional way that we've done for over decades as trade unions. But that's not political strikes.
Do you think that Labour's performance, and as you yourself say, Labour has lost the election, do you think that that poor performance will dent the confidence of the trade union movement as a whole in the potency of Labour as a means of achieving your objectives in Parliament?
Well, part of the problem has been during the last 4 years that the government have achieved many of their objectives through fear of unemployment. And to that extent have weakened the trade union movement. And that in itself weakens our fabric, and we have to start building again. Part of the problem we're faced with now is we fought the campaign in a very distinct platform, a very left-wing platform, on unilateralism. Many of us, myself for example, swallowed our antipathy towards unilateralism, shared the platform, argued for unilateralism, when I never believed in it.
Do you regret that now?
I regret the fact the party took that decision, and I think it militated against us, very, very much so.
But does your faith in the Labour Party as a parliamentary vehicle for trade union aspirations remain undiminished now?
Yes, it does, and I certainly, we have to, as Arthur says, we have to look at this question of proportional representation. The democratic fabric of society is in danger if a third party, or a fourth or a fifth party, get that percentage of votes are not reflected in Parliament. But the alternative government is Labour. There's no question about that. The party of working people of this country is Labour, and we've got to restore the balance.
Arthur Scargill, just a very quick one on the fact that, on Gavin Laird's accusation that the left wing ruined it for Labour by going unilateralist and in other ways.
Absolutely untrue. In fact, if you look at the results, militant candidates, and I'm talking about those who were associated with militant tendency, have come through and taken seats in Liverpool and indeed in Sheffield and other places. And I think that the programme, if anything, was not left-wing enough, not militant enough. And so I would reject completely the point that Gavin's made on that.
Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed. David.
Thank you, Donald. Well, in Penrith, up on the border, the deputy leader of the Conservative Party, the Home Secretary, William Whitelaw, is standing there waiting to talk to Philip Tibbenham. I fear he's talking to him, but we're not hearing what they're saying. We're hearing Big Ben for some extraordinary reason instead, but in a moment, no doubt, we'll get the sound together. Perhaps it was the bells up there at 11 o'clock in the morning with these results in. I think we can go back up there again to Penrith and have another go at talking to Willie Whitelaw.
I'm still getting sort of blasted down there.
Try again. Once again.
Go. Cue, Philip.
I was just asking you, Mr. Whitelaw, how you felt about this landslide for Mrs. Thatcher.
Well, it's a great triumph for the Prime Minister, a great triumph for the whole Conservative Party, a great triumph for all those candidates who fought seats so well. It's a moment for pride for our party, but one of great humility too. It will impose a great business for us as a party to govern in the interests of the whole of the British nation. We have a great opportunity. I'm sure we will live up to it.
But given a majority of this size, what complexion do you see this government taking on, to be frank?
I believe it will be a very sensible Conservative government in the long tradition of our Conservative Party.
Do you expect to be in Mrs. Thatcher's new cabinet?
That is a matter for the Prime Minister. I've always done, and I think everyone would admit I've always done, everything that I've asked to do for my country and for my party. That I shall continue to do.
But would you like to be carried on as Home Secretary?
I would do anything the Prime Minister wants. I would, of course, love to be Home Secretary, but I equally know that the Prime Minister makes up her mind what she wants, what she thinks is best for our party and best for our country. And for the country, that's what I will do. Whatever I'm asked to do, I always have, I always will.
Well, can I put it to you bluntly? If you weren't, how disappointed would you be?
That is up to wait to see. I've yet to be re-elected. I don't even know that yet. I'm going into my account now, and I hope I shall be re-elected, and I shall do after that exactly what is asked of me.
But there's very little doubt about the result here, is it? Let's be honest.
Well, I hope I shall be re-elected.
Would you be prepared to serve in a cabinet which didn't have, say, Mr. Pryor and Mr. Pym in it?
I don't think I am going to make any speculations. After all, these are matters for the Prime Minister. I know she will discuss these matters with me, and I should be delighted to discuss them with her. But it is her decision. She is the Prime Minister, and she must decide what is going to be best for the government of this country. And I, as always, will fit in to whatever she believes is best for the government of this country. I may have my views, I may explain them to her, but I shall certainly do what she thinks is best for the government of our country.
Can I ask you about the opposition? I mean, a lot of people have been expressing great fears about what's going to happen as far as the opposition goes now. Will it completely fall apart, and won't that be bad for government in its own way?
The opposition won't fall apart. In 1945, the Tory party at that time had a very heavy majority against it. Something of the same order, I suppose, as may be the case today. And yet that was a very vigorous and a very determined opposition. And I think we shall face a very vigorous and a very determined opposition. And that is right, and that is good for Parliament and for democracy.
Can I nip back briefly to your own role? Supposing you do stay as Home Secretary, what do you think the chances would be of some move towards the return of capital punishment, given this large Tory majority?
No, I think I am not going to speculate anymore. You asked me a whole lot of very hypothetical questions. I've done my best to answer them. I think I must simply say that what I've always said, I will do what is, I believe, in my leader's view, to be best for the country.
Many thanks, Mr. Whitelaw. Now back to David Dimbleby in the studio.
We've had one result in, the first result of the day, so let's have a look at that. In East Anglia, the most rural seat in Essex, which is Saffron Walden, Alan Hazelhurst holds it for the Conservative. Nice, safe majority there. His vote up a bit. The SDP vote up a bit. John Torode, who some of you who read The Guardian may recognise as a Guardian writer, one of a number of Guardian writers who were standing as SDP candidates, none of whom have got in, and he goes into second place. Labour vote down a bit there in Saffron Walden. It used to be the seat where Rab Butler sat for a long time. Well, now we're going to go and have a look at what is in effect another election that takes place within the United Kingdom, and that, of course, is the election in Northern Ireland. It's always fought on different arguments, different questions arise, very little to do with what goes on in Westminster about unemployment or about cruise missiles or about the economic community, much more to do with the old traditional divisions in Northern Ireland between orange and green, arguments about the border, arguments about security, arguments about the assembly, arguments about the devolution of power. They're fighting under 17 constituencies. They've got new constituencies under Act of Parliament at the last Parliament. But other things have changed there as well. Last October saw the rise of Sinn Féin, the official wing of the IRA, to a parliamentary position, or at least an assembly position in Northern Ireland, winning seats. And they're challenging in many constituencies the more traditional, moderate if you like, SDLP, which previously has represented the Roman Catholic community. Incidentally, Sinn Féin, if they win seats, don't actually take them in the House of Commons, and way back in 1918, there were 73 Sinn Féin MPs elected to the House of Commons, none of whom came to claim their seat, in a huge House of Commons of 707. But then it's not just there that there's division, there's also division among the Unionists, split between the official and the Democratic Unionists. Now, there are four big characters, really, in this battle which is going on today. They don't count until today for security reasons. There's John Hume of the SDLP. Will he, who's been a European MP and a leader of the SDLP, arrive in Westminster for the first time from Foyle? There's Will Enoch Powell survive in Down South, because he's challenged by a Democratic Unionist? Will Gerry Fitt, after a tumultuous, turbulent time in his constituency, finally lose West Belfast and not come back to Westminster? And will Ian Paisley, with a huge vote last time round, hold on in his constituency as well? We're going to go round those four key constituencies now just to find out what the mood is, what the atmosphere is. We haven't heard so much of it during the election, and we're going to get these results during the day. So let's go first to James Robbins, who's in Foyle.
A bitter contest here on the banks of the River Foyle in Londonderry has set Catholic against Catholic. The nationalist voters, 2/3 of the constituents, had the choice: constitutional nationalism, represented by the SDLP, or nationalism with violence, represented by Sinn Féin. John Hume, the SDLP leader, might have been expected to romp home. It seems certain that he has had a very substantial vote, but he's facing a strong challenge from Sinn Féin and Martin McGuinness. John Hume is hoping for a convincing majority, showing a rejection of violence, support for his constitutional approach. Sinn Féin hope to increase their assembly vote last October. We're expecting the result in the early afternoon, but now from the Guildhall in Londonderry, back to London.
And we'll go straight from there to Enoch Powell's seat, to Drummoor, and join Dennis Murray.
The peaceful scene at the Southdown Counting Centre here in the market town of Dromore in the deeply rural agricultural constituency. Well, things could get more exciting here a bit later on because Mr Enoch Powell's 33-year-old parliamentary career is in real danger. His party, the Official Unionists, and Mr Paisley's Democratic Unionists could only make a partial electoral pact. In only 3 constituencies could they agree on a single Unionist candidate. Now, the failure to extend that to Southdown and the resultant split in the Unionist vote could hand the seat to a nationalist, the SDLP's Eddie McGrady. Well, the early news is that the poll here is up at 77% and that the Democratic Unionist candidate, Cecil Harvey, appears to be doing badly, which is very good news indeed for Mr Powell. It looks like a 2-horse race now between Mr Powell and Mr Eddie McGrady of the SDLP. The other count here is the new Lagan Valley constituency, and it's understood there's been a 68% poll there, and the Official Unionist Party leader, James Molyneux, appears to be cantering home in that constituency. And it's ironic that the creation of that new constituency and the removal of the change of the boundaries here in Southdown has taken away Mr Powell's 8,000 vote majority. And now back to the studio.
Sorry about the slight flicker on some of these pictures from Northern Ireland. It's not your set that's wrong. In Belfast City Hall now, Forbes McFall.
Well, here in City Hall, Belfast, it's now certain that Gerry Fitt will not be re-elected as MP for Westminster in Belfast West. The Sinn Féin Vice President, Gerry Adams, has polled very strongly here, and he's heading towards a comfortable victory, perhaps even a runaway victory. If he were to win Belfast West, he would become the first Sinn Féin MP elected to Westminster since 1955. The SDLP candidate here, Joe Hendren, has polled quite steadily, but he's lagging well behind Gerry Adams and Sinn Féin. And just a short time ago, Dr. Hendren came out and talked to reporters, and he said he thought Gerry Adams and Sinn Féin had polled more than any of the other candidates here put together in West Belfast. So it looks as though Adams is heading for a comfortable victory. At this stage, Gerry Fitt, the best that he can hope for is to compete for 3rd place with the Unionist candidates. That's it from City Hall. Back to David Dimbleby in London.
We'll be bringing those results, of course, as soon as they come through. I hope we'll get those results live. Very interesting contests going on in Northern Ireland. Well, now, in a moment, we hope to go over to number 10 Downing Street. I said we were going to have the first interview with Mrs Thatcher. I gather it's been decided on the toss of a coin, so we may not actually be first. In the meantime, Peter and his tin brain, which have been analysing all kinds of things, one thing we haven't looked at is the picture in other countries within the United Kingdom. And I think it's Wales you're going to do, Peter.
Tin brain producing rather beautiful pictures right now, David. Here's the picture of Wales after 36 results. 38 seats in Wales now, 2 more to come. You can just see there's a big grey slab there, Brecon and Radnor, still to come, a marginal seat held by the Conservatives at the moment. And there's Islwyn Neil Kinnock's seat right down, a little tiny slab of grey down the bottom. But there is the picture in Wales, 13 Conservatives. They're improving their position. They're doing what they did in 79. They're moving further ahead in Wales. Labour are down 3. You can see the Tory, the blue slashes down there in the south of Wales in Labour's big stronghold. Liberal SDP Alliance are up 1. Here are the changes in Wales. The Labour Party are down 10. Tories down 2. There's a swing to the Conservatives in Wales as well. All over the country it's going to the Tories, but less in Scotland, more in Wales. Up the 11%, the Liberal SDP Alliance. And here are the gains in Wales. Newport West, Bridgend and Cardiff West, very important. Down in the south of Wales, the Tories are now getting a strong foothold in that great southern stronghold of the Labour Party, and there's that Liberal gain in Montgomery in Wales.
Peter, thanks very much. We'll have more from the tin brain later on. It has lots of things to tell us that are fascinating about this election. But for the moment, let's go and talk at number 10 Downing Street to the Prime Minister, Mrs Thatcher, who's with Sir Robin Day.
Prime Minister, if I may start by asking you in House of Commons style, what are the Prime Minister's engagements for Friday, June the 10th?
Well, I shall be going across to Central Office soon because we have to wait for the rest of the results to come in. Then we shall have to start to think about reshaping the Cabinet. I say reshaping. It's not as it was last time, having to form one from the very word go. So it'll be really rather like a reshuffle. But I think if I don't get it complete fairly quickly, then I think the ladies and gentlemen of the press will do it for me, and I think I'd better decide first.
The press are very good at cabinet making, aren't they? I understand you're having a strategy lunch with Mr Parkinson and Mr Tebbit, is that correct?
No, there will be some people into lunch, but I haven't quite decided who they will be.
Will that be a celebratory lunch or a cabinet making lunch?
No, it'll be getting on with business lunch.
Why do you have to remake your cabinet? I mean, you're presumably quite satisfied with it?
One could carry on just exactly as is now. But I think somehow when you come up to an election, I think it's the time to have a new look, and I think people rather expect a new look, and the combination of those two things is important. And in any event, I feel it's time to have a new look. It will still, may I make it perfectly clear, have a range of people in Cabinet. You always, as I tried to make clear during the election, try to reflect in your Cabinet the spectrum of views within the party.
Without seeking to ask you about details which you won't tell me about, is it the fact that some people want to move, or that you just want that new look you've just spoken of? Are certain things forced on you?
Well, look, what you have to do is that you've had a number of people in the House for quite a time. You've had a number of people in junior posts. You know, people who are climbing the ladder want to be able to climb up another rung. The terrifying thing and frightening thing for me, and it's the worst job I ever have to do here, is that means having to, if some people are to come on the ladder, some people have to climb off. And it's not because they've done the job badly at all. It is because you have to keep movement in politics in order to keep people with something to go for.
I think it was Asquith who said, perhaps in this very building, that a Prime Minister must be a good butcher. Are you a good butcher, Mrs. Thatcher?
No, I'm not a good butcher, but I've had to learn to carve the joint.
Does the question of the speakership affect you? I mean, you have a part in this. Does the choice of your cabinet, to some extent, depend on who might become the Speaker of the House of Commons?
Well, I must consult with the Chief Whip about that, because it's very much a House of Commons matter. And, of course, we have to have made up our minds by next Wednesday, when the first thing the House meets to do is to elect a Speaker. And you'll recall, of course, that that takes place before we have the swearing in.
Are you satisfied with your result? You're obviously pleased. It was a triumph for you in terms of seats, but are you satisfied with the relatively small percentage of the popular vote which you got? And by relatively small, I mean it's smaller than you got last time, slightly. It's smaller than 55, 59, and 51.
And larger than a number of other general elections on which governments have been returned. I think it's inevitable with having another party. The more you fragment the parties, the more your major parties will get a smaller proportion of the vote. The danger is that if that were to go on, you'd eventually get weak government. You know the number of parties you sometimes get on the continent in some countries. They fight on their own little manifesto. No one gets a clear majority. They then go behind locked doors and they just plain do a bartering, horse-trading deal, compromising on everything they've said in the election. And sometimes it can take them months to form an election. That makes for really weak government.
To form a government.
To form a government, yes. Oh, yes, indeed. Their head of state calls someone in, will you try to form a government? And then the things fall apart regularly, and it makes for weak government. It is a bad system, and I hope will not go that way.
Nonetheless, even in your moment of victory, Prime Minister, will you think in answering this question about the 7 million people who voted Alliance, some 25% of the popular vote, yet who will see themselves with about 24 seats? Can you say to them that is fair?
I can say to them that some of the people in the SDP, had they still been returned for the Labour Party when the Labour Party lost, would have been absolutely adamant for the system that's given clear, decisive government, and particularly those who have been Home Secretary. What they want is a system that will put them in, or they believe will put them in, and not a system which for generations has given good, decisive, strong government in this country. I think there's another factor. I think this result, as far as the Alliance is concerned, is partly accounted for, not in any way by the Alliance, because frankly the Alliance did not do very well. They got quite a big proportion of the vote because of the extreme nature of the Labour Party. And had they stayed in the Labour Party and really fought from inside the Labour Party, I hope they would have been able to avoid those extremes. So I think it's a very unusual election from that viewpoint. And if I might look ahead, it's going to make predictions and forecasts in the next general election, which is what we're now working to win, very difficult indeed, because I think the Labour Party will ponder deeply after this election. Extremes are not for Britain. We're not an extreme people, ever.
And you're not going to be an extreme government with your huge majority?
I have not been extreme in the last 4 years. I'm not an extreme person, and we shall not be extreme now. I am adamant for freedom and justice and for defending it. And there'd be something very wrong if I weren't.
You said last night, Prime Minister, that government was a matter of trust. But that being your philosophy, how do you apply that to this huge landslide victory?
I think all power is a trust. Was it Disraeli who said that? Well, it is a trust. It's a great responsibility. And when you get a big result like that, if I may put it this way, you have to be even more careful the way you use that trust and the way you use that responsibility. I wonder if you'd understand that. I don't think I can add to it. It's just something that I feel deeply within me.
Do you also feel deeply that famous principle of Winston Churchill, in victory, magnanimity?
Yes, I do. There are a lot of people who are rather disappointed today, and there's some people in my own party who are a little bit disappointed, and some thrilled with famous victories, particularly after recounts. But we have to carry out what we were elected to carry out, and we shall. But we have to use power wisely and well.
Finally, Prime Minister, you mentioned the next election just now. Could you just tell us when the date of the next election is going to be so we can make our preparations?
It seemed that this was rather a good time of the year to hold it.
Prime Minister, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, so we get a June election, but whether we get it in 4 years, 5 years, 3 years, I don't know, maybe 4 years from now. Mrs. Thatcher, talking about cabinet making, saying that she was not a butcher in reply to Robin's question, but she had to learn to carve a joint. And we have part of one of the joints she carved sitting here, and I can't resist just going over to him, Norman St. John Stevens. I mean, are you a leg or a wing, do you think?
He's roasted. I'm a wing and a prayer.
Do you, just on one serious point, there was talk about you that you would like to be Speaker. Mrs. Thatcher was talking about who might be Speaker. Who would you actually like to see as Speaker of the House of Commons? Who do you think is a suitable person for the job?
Well, I think it really is very unprofitable to speculate about individuals, but I feel very strongly that this must be a matter for the House of Commons. It's part of the dignity and influence of the House of Commons that the members should choose their own Speaker, and I don't myself think it would be a good thing for Parliament if the Speakership became an office that was disposed of just by the Prime Minister. I think it has to be an agreed approach by the whole House of Commons, because it is the highest office in the House of Commons, and the Speaker must be able to speak, not for any one party, but for the whole House.
We'll come back to you in a moment, Mr. Nacivas. Thank you very much. Neil Kinnock, who might, I suppose, if Michael Foot stands down, he was one of the most loyal supporters of Michael Foot right through the campaign, would certainly consider running for the leadership of the Labour Party, was listening to the interview Robin Day was doing with Mrs. Thatcher at Downing Street, leader of the Conservative Party, and may perhaps have some comments on that. He's down there in East Lewin with David Lomax, and David tells me I pronounce this Lewin wrong, but the BBC told me that's how I should say it.
I'm told here it's loin. Anyway, Mr. Kinnock, what is your reaction to the Prime Minister's interview there with Sir Robin Day when she talked about not being an extremist, not being a very good butcher?
I thought that was extraordinary. I mean, she might be an inadvertent and clumsy butcher, but she's certainly laid whole areas of our economy waste and whole areas of our society. And I fear greatly that we shall see a continuation of that in the years ahead to an horrific degree.
Who do you blame for the disastrous Labour result in this election when there are 3.5 million unemployed?
Yeah, some of the seeds of our defeat were laid 3 years ago. And even though they have been neutralised over the last 9-10 months, enough of the memory lingered of the divisions in our movement to make people circumspect about supporting us. And it also meant that some of our policies, very important policies, were partly obscured. Secondly, there is a deferential attitude in the British people, especially at times of crisis, which we're enduring now. Mrs. Thatcher understands that. I think she's deliberately exploited it, mobilised it, and the surrender attitude made a lot of people vote Conservative or even stay away who might otherwise have been expected to vote against the Conservatives and to vote for the alternative policies.
Do you take any personal responsibility yourself because of the way you pushed Michael Foot's candidature forward so strongly as Labour leader?
No, I don't take any responsibility for that. Michael knows that my original counsel was that he couldn't win, and that he shouldn't fight. It then became apparent several months later that he was being drafted by the whole Labour movement. And therefore, I was very glad to support him and work very hard.
But you were a very early, strong supporter.
Yes, from the day on which he decided he was going to run. And I didn't spare any effort in order to get him that majority. I'm very glad that he was elected, since I don't think anyone else, anyone at all, could have done the kind of job that he has done for the Labour movement, and done it with such vigour against such awful attacks, some of the most filthy and assassinating attacks that any political leader in Britain has ever had to endure.
What are your thoughts about the leadership question now?
Oh, that's a question only for one man, and that's for Michael Foot. He must determine exactly what the next step is, and he will secure the agreement of the whole movement to his judgment on that next step.
But presumably there is going to be a debate now, it's already started in the Labour Party, where this is one of the questions which we'll be talking about.
Well, I suppose it does exist in the Labour Party, but it's started in the media, and that's where it's being conducted most ferociously. I still say that the decision is entirely Michael's and no one else's.
But if there were a decision, if you did have support, if you were put forward, would you accept? Would you be in the race?
I must repeat, not through any coyness or wish to evade, but the fact is, and the fact facing my movement is now, that we have a leader who enjoys very considerable support in this movement, and he is the only man who can decide, and he will bear that responsibility as he bears so many other responsibilities.
Mr. Kinnock, thank you very much indeed. And now over to Jeremy Paxman, whom I'm told is with Sir Ian Gilmore.
Sir Ian, do you feel, with the size of the Conservative majority this time, that there's a place in government for people like you and who share your views?
Well, there's a place in government for people like me, but I mean, obviously not for me myself, but I'm sure that people, I needn't name them, who are in the government already will remain in it, because the Tory party embraces a very wide range of opinion, and obviously Mrs. Thatcher wouldn't want to confine that range of opinion representation to just one small segment.
Do you have any reservations about the fact that the alliance may have taken as much as a quarter of the popular vote and yet are getting only a handful of seats?
Yes, I mean, it obviously shows the unfairness of our electoral system, which I'm in favour of reforming. And this result is obviously, I think, an unanswerable argument in favour of reform.
Do you think it does any damage to the parliamentary process?
I don't think it does any damage to the parliamentary process, but it plainly is wrong, as you say, that whatever it is, 7 million people should end up represented by very few MPs.
Would you like to see such change made before the next election?
Well, it can't be, because we've seen what difficulty there's been even redistributing the constituencies. And what's more, I mean, I think it's going to be a long time before it comes, because the majority of both the Conservative and the Labour parties are still against electoral reform, and a House of Commons that's been elected under this system is very unlikely to rush away and vote more or less out of office by bringing in another one.
Are you expecting any change in the complexion of the government given this size of majority?
Well, I wouldn't have thought very much. I think that it will have much the same basis. I think one advantage there will be in this very large majority is that in the last Parliament we had very few representatives from the north and very few people who represented constituencies with high unemployment. Now that will be changed, and have MPs representing, Conservative MPs representing areas with high unemployment, I think will be a very useful influence on the government.
Sir Ian, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, Sir Ian Gilmore there saying that he won't go into Cabinet, and there's no surprise in that. It's 11:25. That's the state of the parties at the moment. 353 Conservative, 199 Labour, 17 Alliance, 4 others. Time perhaps to have a look at how the voting has gone region by region.
Well, there's no doubt it's been a bad night for Labour in both London and the South East. This is the share of the vote in the capital, with all but 2 of the votes now in. We can see the Conservatives with 44%, Labour 30%, the Alliance 25%. But what we have to do really is to look at the change on 1979, because this tells us the real story. It shows quite clearly that while Labour's vote is down 9%, the Liberal SDP Alliance vote is up by 12%. Now, that's not the only bad news for Labour, because while the Tories held on to their own marginals with ease, they dug deep into Labour territory. Feltham and Heston, way down on the list of Labour marginals at number 41, went Conservative. Russell Kerr, the sitting MP for 16 years, was dislodged by Tory barrister Patrick Ground. Outside London, Labour's most spectacular upset was at Slough, where left-wing unilateralist Joan Lester went crashing to defeat at the hands of John Watt. After 17 years in Parliament, did she feel she'd been rejected because of her sympathy for her left-wing policies? That was a question we put to her earlier.
I don't believe that is why they have thrown me out, and if it is why they have thrown me out, I shan't be changing my view in order to get back in. I remain a committed unilateral nuclear disarmer and somebody who will also fight very hard on the question of racial equality. And if that's why people have thrown me out, then I won't be changing.
No regrets on the nature of the campaign?
Well, in the new constituency of Bow and Poplar, another left-wing Labour veteran, Ian Mercado, did manage to hang on, but his notional majority was more than halved to just under 6,000. Martin Young asked Mr Mercado how he explained Labour's poor showing at the polls. Was the party being rejected because of its left-wing policies?
We've been a bit engulfed in a sort of tidal wave which has probably been caused by half a dozen or more different causes of one sort or another. The way the campaign went, the media, the opinion polls, and it must be more than that too. It could be a sort of tidal wave of national masochism.
It could be a tidal wave against left-wing policies that the Labour Party's put forward on this occasion.
Well, it could be, but, you know, it never has been the case in the past that we've done worse when we've had the most radical policies.
A tidal wave of national masochism. Ken Livingstone, how do you account for Labour's lacklustre performance?
I think there are two major factors. The first is we failed to convince ordinary voters that we had a set of economic policies that would resolve the nation's crisis. And contrasting that with the great determination of Thatcher, I think that was why we failed to win. Everything else that's happened, I think, was marginal compared with that fundamental failure.
But did you have the right policies, do you think?
I think to an extent, although our programme's been depicted as a purely left-wing one, it isn't. I mean, it was very much a compromise. I think there's far too much emphasis in the programme on borrowing rather than tackling the control of capital, the great wealth that already exists in this country, which is being squandered.
But what about the other things which are regarded as being very left-wing? I mean, unilateral disarmament, pulling out of the common market, that sort of thing. Don't you think that scared a lot of people away?
Well, I think it did. I think this is part of the problem. We had virtually 2 weeks of reporting of opinion polls. We didn't have 2 weeks of real debate about defence. We had a lot of clichés. It never came over to people in Britain that Polaris is not under our complete independent control. The Polaris system is integrated into what is predominantly the American nuclear structure. And we're not in a position where that is something completely independent. Now, I think if that point had got across, we could have turned round the debate on Polaris.
Now, we've seen how the alliance vote was built up entirely at Labour's expense, almost exclusively. Don't you think that's because people wanted something more moderate? They were put off, they were frightened by your manifesto.
No, I think people didn't feel convinced that we had the economic policies, and a lot of other people, I suppose, to a degree, have been disturbed by the publicity, but the fact we've had a 4-year assassination campaign from the press would not have mattered if we could have got across the economic policies. And if you actually look in London, we have maintained our base.
Earlier last night, you were saying that the struggle between the government and the Labour movement will move outside the limelight and will pass from Parliament. Now, what did you mean by that?
Well, when you've got a majority this enormous in Parliament and so loyal to the Prime Minister, clearly she can get anything she wants through Parliament. And therefore, the fact that she is now intending to move against Labour councils that are dissenting from her policies and the trade unions means that that focus to the resistance to those policies will take place outside.
But are you going to try and bring the government down by unparliamentary means?
I think we may very well find the government brings itself down. If you look back at all these huge landslide majorities, both here and in America, always within a couple of years, the government overreaches itself and there's a reaction. I think that will happen here.
Ken Livingstone, many thanks. Well, that's the situation in the South East. Now, hand you back to David Dimbleby.
So that's how the regional pattern's been in your particular region. Let's now come back to national politics for a moment, and let's have a bit of fun and do some cabinet making. You heard Mrs Thatcher saying that she was going to reconstruct or change or alter her cabinet a bit by the weekend, she thought. And why don't we have a bit of amusement anyway and just seeing what it is she might do and why, quite seriously, she might want to do it, who she might want to move around. Peter, first of all, has got some ideas about what she could do.
She certainly has started the speculation, David. 3 major question marks over 3 major figures in the cabinet today. Francis Pym there, the Foreign Secretary. He'd like to stay, but my goodness, after what Mrs. Thatcher said about carving the joint, what chance does he have? Willie Whitelaw, the Deputy Prime Minister, Home Secretary. He said he'd like to stay Home Secretary. He also said that he'd do whatever the Prime Minister wanted him to do. And Sir Geoffrey Howe, the Chancellor, we know he wants to be Foreign Secretary. Maybe he's one of the people that Mrs. Thatcher thought should go up the ladder a bit. So, starting with the Home Secretary's post, who's going to succeed Mr. Whitelaw if, as he says privately, he is prepared to move aside, stay in the Cabinet perhaps, stay Deputy Prime Minister, but move aside? Perhaps a hot tip is Norman Tebbit, someone who Mrs. Thatcher would almost certainly like to see move up the ladder. He, after all, was a strong articulator of Thatcherite policies during the campaign. Very high profile. He, Mrs. Thatcher may feel, deserves a reward. What about Mr. Pym, then, as Home Secretary? Could Mrs. Thatcher move him aside? I suspect that after what she said this morning, Mr. Pym is due for a step down rather than a sideways step. There's Leon Britton, a Home Office Minister before. Maybe he's due for a step up. He's now Chief Secretary of the Treasury. Perhaps he could be a Home Secretary. Well, what about Mr. Pym's post as Foreign Secretary if he moves aside or indeed down? Who's going to succeed Mr. Pym? And the best guess, of course, is Sir Geoffrey Howe, which would leave the Chancellorship free for Mrs. Thatcher to move somebody else into. One guess, perhaps, is a senior minister, Patrick Jenkin, Industry Secretary at the moment, a loyal Thatcherite, and also a minister with who's due great respect from all parts of the party. Rivals, though, for that position, no doubt, Nigel Lawson, economic minister, energy minister with strong Thatcherite economic philosophy. Maybe he's a contender too. Leon Britton, perhaps also as Chief Secretary, might be quite glad to be Chancellor. Mrs. Thatcher may feel he deserves it. And perhaps Cecil Parkinson too is due for a step up after his successful election campaign, indeed his profile articulation of the government's policies. So finally we're left then with the question, what of the wets? Francis Pym we've talked about, and there is Jim Pryor there and Peter Walker. David.
Peter, thank you very much. Well, with me is our political editor, John Cole, who for many years has kept his ear very close to the ground of British politics. I'm going to put those points to him in a moment, but first of all, just a glimpse of David Steele in his Arran pullover, getting into his car, having finally got up and emerged. We go up to our reporter up there. Well, I gather Michael Cole is not around. The figure of Lord Chitness, incidentally, there in the spectacles and a neat business suit, no rustic Arran pullovers for him at any time of day, who's been with David Steele right through this campaign, guiding him, the figure you always saw just behind him as he went through the crowds, and who played a very leading part in organising that campaign. David Steele goes off, I know not where. Back to cabinet making. Oh, a full-form result. Sorry, let's just see this from Cornwall South East. This is a result that's just come in. I think we've only had 2 or 3 so far today, so we might as well see them all. This is a Conservative hold with a fairly safe majority. Robert Hicks, who was the MP for Bodmin from 1970, and he holds safely on to that seat. It was a seat that Peter Bessel used to hold for the Liberals between 1964 and 1970. Now, back to this cabinet business. John.
Yes, David.
You heard what Peter said. Do you broadly agree with it? Do you have any suspicions now, after the thing is over, what it is that she might actually be going to do this weekend?
Yes, well, I mean, obviously all the politicians are being very coy, David, about it, because there are going to be consultations today. The Prime Minister will talk to Mr Whitelaw, to the Chief Whip, Michael Jopling, and to Cecil Parkinson, the party chairman, and probably to Norman Tebbit, who's very much become a familiar. It's clear to me that Willie Whitelaw is likely to move from the Home Secretaryship, and in spite of what he said in the interview, I think he's quite reconciled to that idea, to taking one of the sinecure jobs, still being Deputy Prime Minister and chairing a lot of cabinet committees for Mrs Thatcher. He's a very loyal man, as we saw by that interview, and he'd be happy to do that if that's what she decides. The Chancellor, if you'd asked me 6 weeks ago, I suppose I would have said that the Chancellor was almost certain to go to the Foreign Office. At that time, that was certainly his wish, but it was based on the assumption that the Prime Minister wouldn't think anyone should stay at the Treasury as longer than any Chancellor since the war except Dennis Healy. That's not quite so certain now. It's just possible that she'll ask him to stay on there for a bit longer, which I may say will disappoint a lot of other aspirants, because the Treasury is the most coveted post, as you know.
And would please him?
And I think he would like to stay there at least for a time longer in the hope that his economic policies will show more success against unemployment. But on the other hand, the move he wants is to the Foreign Office rather than to the Home Office. As a lawyer, he tends to be typecast as a natural Home Secretary. That's not what Geoffrey Howe wants. He doesn't want to be Lord Chancellor.
He wants the glamorous life.
He wants to do interesting things, and he thinks he's got something to contribute to foreign affairs.
What about Cecil Parkinson? What do you actually make of him as ministerial? I mean, I know he's in the cabinet, and we saw him defending the government's position on the Falklands very vociferously, and he's thought to be a good chairman. But what would he actually be like as cabinet material in a really senior position of state? Has he had enough experience for that, do you reckon?
Well, he's had comparatively little experience, a junior office at the Department of Trade, but clearly Mrs Thatcher thinks very highly of him for the two reasons that you mentioned, the Falklands on the one hand, and his performance as party chairman during this election on the other. Now, I have heard within the past few days his name mentioned as a possible Foreign Secretary. That really would astonish a lot of his colleagues, because it would be as meteoric a rise as David Owens to that job. But Cecil Parkinson would obviously like that job very much, and he is being mentioned for it. Norman Tebbit, as well as being mentioned as Home Secretary, is also possibly interested in an enlarged Department of Industry and Trade. That is combining the two departments. It would keep him in the economic field, and although he has his own ideas on law and order, which perhaps are nearer to Mrs Thatcher's than Francis Pym's would be, nevertheless, I suspect he might like to stay in the economic field, which the industry job would allow him to do.
Thanks very much, John. Behind you while you're talking, Lady Howe, rather looking, well, I won't say looking like, but in the same pose as Mrs Wilson. Do you remember at number 10 when Wilson won the election, taking photographs of the crowds outside?
Does she look like a lady who's going to move house or not? That's what we have to decide.
I don't know. Does she look like a student at the LSE, which is what she is? No, she doesn't, is the answer. Anyway, it's a very good vantage point to take snaps from.
It is indeed.
Well, now, I don't think we have any more results coming through from them. We'll keep a close eye on them, though, and if we do get any indication of results from anywhere, we'll bring them to you straight away. In the meantime, let's go across to Donald McCormick.
Well, as that noise of cabinet making builds up to a crescendo, one man who wants to add to it is Norman St John Stevens. What do you think of the balance of Mrs Thatcher's cabinet? What's it likely to be? Are the wets, as it were, going to stay in, as Sir Ian Gilmour was saying a little while ago?
I don't want to add to it at all. I think it's a great impertinence of us, really, to be making Mrs Thatcher's own cabinet.
Impertinently as ever, we must crash to Downing Street, Mr St John Stevens.
Right. In Downing Street, Mrs Thatcher makes her first excursion outside number 10 since her return here at about 5 o'clock this morning. She'll be making the very short car ride to the Conservative Central Office. A bright blue dress today, posing on the pavement, and now into the car, accompanied by her husband, Dennis. Some cheers from onlookers behind us. It's been very busy here in Downing Street this morning, apart from the flowers and champagne that I think you've seen. There have been messages from a number of other world leaders, messages of congratulation. We've not been told from whom the messages have come, but it has been very busy and a very happy atmosphere. There goes her familiar black Daimler limousine with its escort off to Conservative Central Office for that lunch she was telling Sir Robin Day about, and we expect her to remain there for about an hour and a half. Now, back to the studio.
Well, I'm sure Norman St John Stevens doesn't mind being interrupted for the Prime Minister's departure
Not
from
at
number
all.
10.
Not at all.
On the point of her cabinet, what's your own view of the future, particularly, which David and John were talking about, the future of Mr Cecil Parkinson?
Well, I think that it's a very interesting idea. I'm sure that Mr Parkinson would in fact do the job of Foreign Secretary extremely well. He's been a very successful party chairman, for example, which requires diplomatic gifts. You've got to get on with all sorts of people. That would be a very good qualification for the Foreign Office. He's had considerable experience of work abroad at the Department of Trade. I think perhaps most important of all is this, that all Prime Ministers, in the end, want to be their own Foreign Secretaries, and therefore they've got to have someone as Foreign Secretary whom they can get on with and who is of like mind. And I think if you look at that in that particular light, I think Mr Parkinson has very many qualifications, but I mean, that's the idlest speculation on my part, just looking at it from the outside.
Well, joining us now from our studio in Newcastle is one person who, unhappily for him, will not be indulging in any kind of cabinet making over this weekend, Bill Rogers of the SDP, who narrowly lost his seat in Stockton North last night. Bill Rogers, the morning after the night before, what went wrong, does it seem to you?
Well, I don't think anything went wrong in the sense that it was not anticipated, and I'm afraid I thought I was going to lose, though I fought as hard as I could to win. But the mistake we made, I think, when the SDP was launched, to think that we could make it in one, and really we're a two-stage rocket. You can't break down two of the old parties in one go. Up here and, of course, throughout the country, we made tremendous inroads into the Labour Party. No question about that, and the Labour Party is never going to be the same again. But Mrs. Thatcher's authority, the standing of the Conservative Party, particularly because of the failure of the official opposition, the Labour Party, over the last 4 years, enabled Conservatives to do very well. I won very few former Conservative votes, and without some former Conservative votes, I couldn't possibly win.
You say the Labour Party will never be the same again. Is there a danger, from your point of view, that it will now change in the direction of becoming more right-wing or moving towards the centre, and so perhaps preempting you as the kind of West German-style social democratic party, which is, I think, why you left it in the first place?
I'd be very surprised indeed. It isn't only a matter of the short-term question of whether it's left or right, but there's going to be a great deal of bloodletting. You see all the candidates queuing up and giving their interviews today with their eye on what's going to happen in October. There's going to be great bloodletting over the leadership, and the left will say that a left-wing manifesto was abandoned by Dennis Healey and Roy Hattersley and company. I mean, there's going to be a tremendous row. But the other point, and I have to say it's far more important, fundamentally, why we're here, why the SDP exists, and why we're going to win in the end. We're going to form a government. I'm not joining in cabinet making this weekend, but I expect to walk through the door of number 10 as a member of an SDP alliance government before I leave politics for good. The reason why
Mr. Rogers, let me interrupt you just for the time being. We're going to Tory party headquarters at Smith Square in London,
where she's come to pay the traditional vote of thanks to all her workers. Here she is now coming to meet Mrs. Parkinson, Mr. Garner, and a bouquet of flowers sent specially from Jersey to one of the messengers here. And Mr. Thatcher is here, close by me, just outside Mr. Parkinson, as they're going in. Good morning, Mr. Thatcher. Good morning, Margaret. Good morning. Congratulations. Good morning. Followed by Mr. Lawson, her marketing director, then Mr. Thatcher, Mr. Ian Gow. And applause as she enters central office. She's going there, actually, now to talk to the 300 or 400 odd staff. And it's really business as usual now. The election is over. She is Prime Minister again. The press here are all put back behind pens. We're not allowed inside central office anymore. As I say, business as usual. It's not like last night where we saw her speech. So back now to Donald, to Donald McCormick.
Thank you very much indeed, Fred. Well, what about all that bloodletting, Austin Mitchell, that Bill Rogers was so confidently predicting in your party now?
Well, there won't be any bloodletting, I don't think. I think what is said is correct, that the Labour Party now needs to move back to the middle of the road where we should have been all along. And had we been there, the SDP wouldn't have happened. I thought the whole spectacle of the alliance was totally tasteless, because the only condition of their survival is that they destroy the Labour Party. In other words, they're committed to destroying the only instrument for social progress and the only instrument for protecting working people in this country as a precondition of their own rise to power. They are, therefore, essentially acting like middle-class Trotskyites, because the condition of their existence is they must make things worse. They must break the two-party system with all the leverage for change that it provides before things can get better. They want essentially to return us to the three-party deadlock of the 1920s and 1930s, which entrenched Tories in power through that period, and they are in part responsible for the return of this Tory government and for all that happens now.
Bill Rogers, would you like a response on that?
Austin knows that's absolute nonsense. And anyone who believes in electoral reform as he does shouldn't be talking in that way. No, the truth of the matter, and this is the point I really think is one which the Labour Party, it's not for me to give advice to the Labour Party, but should think very hard about. It is social and economic change which has made the working people of this country very different in their aspirations, their style, their expectations. And Mrs. Thatcher, one of the reasons why she's done so well is that in an odd way she's taken account of that. And one reason why the Labour Party is finished, I'm afraid, is because it's been unable to adjust in that way. It still believes that the working people of this country like trade unions manipulating the government of the day. It still believes that the trade unions are the best representatives of working people linked with Labour. Now, that's been a sea change in the attitude of people in Britain. As long as the Labour Party doesn't realise that, even if they make Austin Mitchell the leader of the party, they can't possibly win.
Is there going to be some bloodletting, however, Bill Rogers, inside your own alliance in view of the stresses and strains which David Steele predicted before the results came in, if one of the two partners ended up with much more seats than the other, which is exactly what's happened?
Well, there isn't a great deal of blood to be let at the moment, I have to frankly say. I don't think there will be. The fact is that the alliance together, the SDP joining Liberals, have got far more votes than the Liberals have ever had before, and everybody knows this. We've got to stay in partnership. The terms of that partnership, I expect, will be very similar to the ones we've had. We shall be fighting the European elections. Maybe it's a terrible thought to think of another election in a year's time. European elections in a year's time, local elections as well. And I don't think that it's too soon to begin thinking now exactly how we shall deal with the general election when it comes. A lot of hard work ahead, but I think no bloodletting at all in my company.
Gentlemen, thank you all very much indeed. In the meantime, we hope to hear more from you later. David.
Donald, thank you. David Basnett, the chairman of the Trade Union for Labour Victory, the organisation that tried to get the Labour Party pulled together for this election, has made a statement calling on the party to act swiftly to resolve the leadership issue. He said the Labour Party spent too much time on internal affairs and bickering when they really ought to have spent that time getting across their policy on jobs and social services. The leadership issue has got to be clarified as quickly as possible. Our policies have to be exposed, and we must look to ourselves as a movement. David Basnett making the first steps and giving the first indications, perhaps, of how the trade unions may react. Well, now, David Steele, I think we're going to have... Oh, there... I don't know whether he's there or not. I've lost him. But anyway, David Steele at Ettrick Bridge.
Here's David Steele. He looks very refreshed after 5 or 6 hours sleep, walking back to his house having done a couple of radio interviews. He's in his Ettrick Bridge summit wear, which is baggy Aran sweater, blue jeans and tennis shoes. Lucky clothes for him on that occasion, and he's come back to Cherry Dean in order to do television interviews before he holds a press conference across the way in the village hall. We're going down to the Rose Garden, which I think has recovered from the trampling it got from press photographers a couple of Sundays ago. He's made a few notes on the back of one of his campaigning leaflets, and he's obviously
That's the truth behind television interviews. All is exposed. I hope we may be able to get up there later on for an interview. In the meantime, from Belfast, an interview with Gerry Fitt, who we were talking about a moment ago.
Gerry Fitt, here in West Belfast, it looks as though we're going to see a Sinn Féin landslide. Do you concede defeat?
I think there is absolutely no doubt about that. Although we haven't yet been told what the total poll is, I think by looking at the ballots as they come out of the ballot boxes, there is no doubt that a massive victory has been given to the Sinn Féin candidate.
How do you explain this win for Gerry Adams that seems to be in prospect?
I think it's very difficult to explain. West Belfast certainly was the cockpit. Gerry Fitt and Gerry Adams were locked in a great struggle. Mr. Adams was the key figure in the Sinn Féin movement, so therefore a great deal of activity was concentrated in West Belfast. There was also rumours that there was a large-scale impersonation and taking votes illegally. But leaving that aside, Gerry Adams has won a victory. Now, it is a victory which frightens me, because it would appear, and it will certainly be interpreted by the outside world, that the Catholic population are endorsing candidates who are openly associated and politically apologise for the men of violence. And I think that that paints a very, very dark future for the whole, not only in Northern Ireland, but indeed for the whole island of Ireland.
Do you think it is a vote for the IRA, that such a massive vote for Sinn Féin?
Yes, I absolutely believe so. There was no doubt what the issues were in this election. It wasn't about housing and about jobs and about the public sector borrowing requirement or the rate of inflation. It was, do you endorse the activities of political Sinn Féin and their Siamese twin, the IRA? The electorate in West Belfast have certainly come out and given them a massive endorsement for that. That's why I say the scenario was very, very frightening.
Jerry Fitt, your own political future from here on in?
Well, I think it's rather strange, and even though I will be defeated in this election, this is my 25th election, the one thing which has made it easier to bear is this. I, as a socialist, have always tried to bring together the Catholic and the Protestant working class in Northern Ireland. In this election, although I am going to be defeated, the votes which have been cast for me come equally from the Falls Road and the Shankill Road, from the Protestant and Catholic working class. And even though I am defeated, I'm very, very proud of that fact.
Are you going to stay in politics?
It's very hard to say. After I leave this hall this afternoon, I'll probably have to reassess my whole life because my home has been attacked many times. I don't see any reason why I should continue to stay there.
Jerry Fitt, thank you.
One, perhaps, of the bravest MPs that's ever been seen in the House of Commons, Jerry Fitt, who came to Westminster in 1966, who literally lives as in an encampment in his house with barricades on both sides. It's been attacked at terrible times with riots outside at night and all the rest of it. A really very brave man whose life's been in danger, who had to campaign from inside his house, defeated by the Sinn Féin candidate. He concedes there with support from the Roman Catholic community for a party that is the official wing, political wing of the IRA. The end to rather a sad story, though perhaps Jerry Fitt will come back. There were stories that he might actually come and live in England and get away from it all, and it would be not least perhaps that he deserved after that political career. Now, we've had one more result in. Let's just have a look at this from the north, Rother Valley. It's a Labour hold. Kevin Barron takes it, a coal miner. Let's just see, though, the effect there on his vote. His majority at 8,000, 8,500 is down from 14, nearly 15,000, a drop of about 13%. It's the SDP who's taken most of that vote, though they've taken about half their votes from the Conservatives, so a very similar story to what we've seen elsewhere. Well, now, with the state of the parties, Conservatives 355, Labour 201, just disappearing from our screen, let's for a moment turn to the United States. We've heard during this campaign, remember Mrs. Thatcher went over there to the Williamsburg summit, and there'd been talk about President Reagan welcoming the return of a Conservative government under Mrs. Thatcher. Well, Martin Bell, our correspondent in Washington, has been following reaction there in Washington, and we've just received this report from him by satellite. I don't know where it is.
The result is described in this morning's Washington Post as a landslide victory for the Conservatives, but by no means an unequivocal endorsement of Mrs. Thatcher and her policies. No British election in recent times has commanded so much interest and attention over here. That's partly because of Mrs. Thatcher's personal popularity in the United States, partly because of the Labour Party's defence policies and anxiety in Washington about any move towards unilateralism. Also, the Americans have been busy comparing their politics and ours. Here, too, there's a basically Conservative government in office seeking to retain popularity in the face of high unemployment. Mrs. Thatcher showed that it can be done, and leading Republicans like Indiana Senator Richard Lugar were quick to take comfort from that.
I always draw lessons from everybody's experience. It seemed to me that the new modernized British campaign was interesting to watch in the same way as new technical factors in our campaign are, but I think philosophically, Mrs. Thatcher and the Conservatives were on a basic course of market economics and strong national policies with regard to foreign response. Those are always appropriate. It appears to us in the United States that the policies that Great Britain has adopted are reasonably compatible with those of Ronald Reagan and Republicans in the Senate here, and so there was a great deal of interest in the furtherance of economic growth.
Senator, I get the impression there's no doubt whose side you were on in this one.
That's true. I favored Mrs. Thatcher, and it's not my prerogative to interfere. We did not make comments throughout the campaign, but clearly her policies, I think, were compatible with the feelings that I have. On the other hand, her problems are enormous, as are ours in the United States. And I think, regardless of the size of the victory, and it is very sizable indeed, the problems won't go away. How we're going to make this transition from mature industries, how we're going to make growth happen, and the locomotive may come out of the United States, it may come out of Great Britain, one or the other, but it must come out of somewhere because the rest of the world is looking to that kind of leadership.
Martin Bell reporting from Washington. Well, now, David Steele has re-emerged at Ettrick Bridge, and I gather the black Labrador with him was the cause of the termination of the last interview before it had started. Our cameraman apparently tripped over the Labrador, fell into the rose garden, and that's why we didn't get the interview. So let's have another go. Michael Cole is with him.
Yes, Jill is certainly the star here, apart from the one I'm sitting with, David Steele. Mr. Steele, you've slept on it. What is your verdict on the election and the results as we know them so far?
Well, I still this morning feel a real sense of outrage at the vast number of votes we piled up with so little to show for it in the way of seats. I mean, to secure over a quarter of the electorate's support is a remarkable achievement, and I think we can be very satisfied with that. But I am very angry that we haven't got more seats out of it, and I do believe that such is the basic sense of fair play and justice in the electorate as a whole, that sense of outrage isn't going to be confined to the people who voted for us. I think a lot of people who voted Conservative or Labour will agree now that the electoral system ought to be changed.
The party you'll be leading to the House of Commons isn't going to be as big as you would like to have been, but what tactics are you going to adopt there? Are you going to work with Labour against...
No, I mean, there is no bridging gap there, so that there's no question of working with Labour. I think the Labour Party is going to be concerned with its own internal problems for the next period in politics, and therefore we must simply get on with the job of pressing forward the policies in our manifesto, offering constructive criticism of the government's policies. And I've spoken to Roy Jenkins and David Owen this morning, and we're going to go on working together in the next Parliament as we did in the last.
So what are you going to say to those Liberals, and there'll be many, who will say you should break with the SDP at this stage?
Well, that's a matter they can discuss at the conferences in the autumn. I don't believe that'll be anything like a majority view. I think that the effect that we had together as an alliance was so strong that it makes common sense to continue to keep it in being.
So you would like to go on together as an alliance, but with perhaps yourself as the leader?
Well, we didn't have a leader in the last Parliament, and we won't have in this one either. I mean, the two parties will go on with their separate existence, but what we have agreed is that we will work closely together.
I think a lot of people in the Labour Party will be rather angry with the alliance. They'll feel that you've caused the Tory landslide by allowing it to happen, by taking so many of their votes as they would see them.
I don't think that can be said. I think that if they really felt that, their obvious answer is to go for electoral reform. I mean, they better be logical about it. I think they should be angry with themselves that they have allowed their party to drift to the left over the last few years, and they have been proved to be deeply divided in organisation and in policy during the election campaign. As I said, it all came apart at the seams. People who were the so-called moderates in the Labour Party began the election admitting that they didn't really subscribe to parts of the manifesto, but thought it was best for party unity, and I think that was an intellectually unsustainable position, and it did fall apart during the election. So I don't think they should blame us. I think they should blame themselves. The official opposition has been found seriously wanting in this last Parliament. People clearly wanted something new, and they found it in us. I think they were entitled to see better representation as a result of their switch of allegiance.
David Steele, thank you very much. Back to David Dimbleby.
So David Steele there talking about the whole problem of proportional representation and whether the Alliance Party has been fairly dealt with. So let's just have a look at that with Peter Snow and some graphics to demonstrate what's happened.
David, the fact is that in this election, more people have voted for the Alliance, more single votes have gone to the Alliance than have ever been given to the Liberal Party in British history. Now, here's the measure, then, of Mr. Steele's disappointment. Conservatives on 11.5 million popular votes there, Labour Party on 7.9 million, and the Liberal SDP Alliance running up to 7 million votes, the best ever for the third party there in British politics. And in 1923, they had that kind of share of the vote, 29%, 26%, but they won 158 seats. And look at how the forecast places them this time. The Tories on 398, Labour on 209, about half the Tories, but the Liberal SDP Alliance forecast there to win 21 seats. Now, just look what would happen if this were a constitution with an electoral system of proportional representation. Just watch how that forecast would change and how the parties would balance up. There we go. The Tories would be on 279, the Labour Party would be on 190, the Liberal SDP Alliance would be on 167. And when you put in the differences there. You can see what would have happened between the old Parliament and this one. And there's the winning post with the Tories way short of it, about 50 short of the winning post. It would be a hung Parliament with all sorts of possible balances of power possible there. All sorts of negotiations for coalitions and so on would be possible. So that really is the measure of the disappointment for the Liberals.
We've had news that the Cabinet's going to have its first meeting on Thursday, the new Cabinet, that is, which Mrs Thatcher is going to form over the weekend. And perhaps more ominous news for many people who have mortgages, the building societies are to hold a special meeting in 12 days' time on June the 22nd to decide whether or not to put up their interest rates. You may remember before the election they decided not to have the meeting because, in their words, they didn't want it to be influenced or didn't want it to become part of the political game, whether they put their interest rates up or not. But they're meeting at a special meeting on June the 22nd. Now, we've had one or two more results in, perhaps we should just look at. Cornwall North, this was the seat that John Pardoe sat for. The Liberals were hoping to take it this time. They didn't. The Conservatives safely back in. Jerry Neal has been there since '79, with his vote actually slightly up. And then Beverley, safe Conservative hold. Sir Patrick Wall, and his share of the vote there in that northerly seat, lovely Beverley Minster on Humberside, goes up just marginally. Chelsea, Nicholas Scott, again a very safe Conservative seat, one of the safest I think probably in the country, fourth safest in Britain it's called, and he has a majority of 12,000, a very tiny change, and a little bit of shift between Liberals and the SDP.